Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Shani Roper. I'm the curator of the University of the West Indies Museum, and we're having part two of our discussion on monuments in the Caribbean. And our focus today is on the artist perspective. It's a discussion that we cannot have without speaking to the curators, or the artists rather, who are involved in the production of monuments and other visual art pieces that interpret culture, society, and everyone's experiences. So we really need to have this discussion with them. Before I introduce our speakers, we're going to do some household matters. There was a limited amount of people who were invited to join this discussion, so you won't be able to speak. We're going to ask if you have questions, just put them in the chat here. For those of us joining us on Facebook Live, just write your questions in the chat. We have people monitoring it, and we will bring them up and ask our artists these questions and presenters rather as the conversation progresses. Each artist is going to present for about 15 minutes. They'll be sharing PowerPoints. And then afterwards, we'll have the Q&A. So I'm going to just ask that you just be patient and join us. I hope you enjoy this, and I'm certainly looking forward to it because we have great panelists with us today. So our first panelist for today will be Dr. Marsha Paris, who is a lecturer and visual arts unit coordinator at the Department of Creative and Festival Arts at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. She has worked as a senior editor and art writer for Arc Caribbean Art and Culture magazine, and is a consulting editor for Moco Caribbean Arts and Letters magazine. She also served on the board of the National Museum and Art Gallery of Trinidad and Tobago. Her research and critical writings about visual culture have been published in several art catalogs, as well as peer-reviewed academic journals and books. Her scholarly work includes her practice as a curator. She has created art exhibitions in collaboration with the National Portrait Gallery London and the British Council, as well as her more recent exhibition project with the Paris Art Museum, Miami. In the midst of this current pandemic, she has been leading an artists conversation series titled Quarantine and Art. And we've, as much as possible, tried to share some of that series on the UWI Museum page. So after Dr. Paris, we'll have Camille Cheddar, who was born in Manchester, Jamaica, and she graduated from Edna Manley College with an honors diploma in painting and received an MFA from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Her works have been featured in exhibitions at the National Gallery of Jamaica, the Museum of Latin American Art, the Portland Museum of Art, and the Wallace Art Gallery of Columbia University. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Albert Huey Award, the Reed Foundation Scholarship, and the inaugural Don Scott Memorial Award, and the British Council TAARE Program Award. She has been an artist in residence at Alice Yard in Trinidad, Art Omi in New York, and Hospital Field in Scotland. She's the project manager of the Rubis Mecenats Impulse Art Project, I'm massacring the name, and lectures at the Edna College of Visual and Performing Art. She lives and works in Kingston, Jamaica. Our third panelist is Rosa Garmendia, Rosa Garmendia. She is a socially engaged, multidisciplinary artist who produces work at the nexus of contemporary art and activism. Her work is rooted in social issues, particularly the intersectionality of her identity as a woman, immigrant, and industrial worker. The driving impulse is her desire to use art as a tool to create discourse, challenge traditional views, and build understanding. She reflects on and analyzes norms and values in contemporary society, and her projects focus on the critically view the role of the police, acts of racism, poverty, and US foreign policy. She was born in Havana, Cuba, and immigrated to the US at the age of 8. She studied at various universities and art institutes, including the University of South Florida, Parsons School of Design, University of Miami, Vermont Studio Center, and the Fort Lauderdale Art Institute. She's a teaching artist at the Perez Art Museum, Miami since 2008, and through her discourse and artistic practice, she continues to reaffirm her place in a larger community that transcends socially imposed geographical and ethnic borders. Jordi Minaya, which I'm sure I'm massacring as well, but my apologies, is a Dominican United Statesian multidisciplinary artist whose recent works focus on destabilizing historic and contemporary representations of an imagined tropical identity. Minaya attended the Escuela Nacional des Arts Visuales, in Santo Domingo in 2009, the Altos de Chaban School of Design, and the Parsons New School for Design. She has participated in residencies at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, Gothenburg Arts, Smack Mellon, and the Bronx Museum's AIM program. She has been awarded a Socrates Sculpture Park Emerging Artist Fellowship, as well as grants by Artadia, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Rima Hart Mann Foundation, and the Nancy Graves Foundation. Minaya's work is in the collection of the Museo de Arte Moderno and the Centro Leon, I think it's Jimenez, is that right? Yeah, in the Dominican Republic. All right. How is it pronounced, Jordy?
What were you saying? The Centro Leon? Jimenez.
Jimenez.
Yes.
Thank you. In the Dominican Republic. Okay, other than my massacring of the Spanish language, thank you all for joining us today. And I'm going to start with Marsha.
Thank you, Shani. Let me share my screen. You seeing it? You seeing the slides?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So it's not as clear.
Clear?
Because we're only seeing the top of the monument.
Are you seeing the title and my name? No?
Oh, I'm not seeing it. Are you guys seeing it?
I'm seeing
okay,
it.
Everybody
Yeah,
else is seeing it. Okay. All right. No problem. Go ahead.
Slide?
Yeah. Go ahead. It's fine.
Okay, great. So I've been looking at artists' work during this time and reflecting on their practice. I will share some of those reflections and in the process, make a case for contemporary art in relation to current debates about monuments. So I've titled my presentation, Monuments as Sites of Our Textured Experience. The late Jamaican scholar, Rex Nettleford, repeats a word in his book on cultural dynamics and identity in the Caribbean. That word is textured. Nettleford uses it to describe Caribbean ancestry, history, and experience. Through his repetition of the word, he emphasizes past and present experiences that are not smooth, a history that is not straightforward, contemporary lives that are not uncomplicated. Our experiences in the Caribbean are nuanced, complex, relational, intertwined, textured. It is this notion of textured experience that I'm borrowing to help frame how we might think about monuments. And so I'm asking, how might we engage practices of representation so that our public memory retains our textured experiences? To consider this question, I will turn now to a case in Martinique, and I will then follow with a look at the work of some Caribbean artists. A statue of Empress Josephine, Napoleon's wife, stood in La Savane Park in Fort-de-France for many years. In 1991, it was decapitated and later spattered with paint, action taken in defiance of the statue's tie to colonialism. Empress Josephine is believed to have played a role in efforts to reinstate slavery. Last month, news reports confirmed the statue had been torn down amid global Black Lives Matter protests. I'm interested, however, in the texture the headless statue represented in the decades it was left standing. The head was never found and the sculpture was left unrestored. The headless statue allowed for a different reading, a less than straightforward representation of history. It was symbolic of discourse and counter-discourse. It captured the textures of dissent and resistance and commemorated power from another source, a power from below. Put another way, the absent head allowed for other elements to become visible or present. These ideas of absence and visibility are taken up in recent work by Luis Vasquez-Laroche, an artist of Trinidadian and Venezuelan heritage. A few weeks ago in the US, Vasquez-Laroche enacted a performance titled The Impossibility. The work involved the building of a monument. Vasquez-Laroche, who has been living and studying in Richmond, Virginia, used bricks he had collected to build a base structure. In his research of the history of materials, Vasquez-Laroche learned enslaved people would harvest clay from the James River in Virginia to make bricks. The brick, therefore, is a conscious, deliberate symbol in the work. Vasquez-Laroche also used palm oil to make casts of human body parts, which he piled on top of the brick base. Palm oil is another intentional material in the work. The artist harnesses the history of palm oil, a substance that was used in combination with gunpowder and lemon juice, to cover bruises and marks on the bodies of the enslaved before they were sold. In Vasquez-Laroche's monument, the palm oil also offers an ephemeral quality. As the artist built the piece, the palm oil body casts melted, leaving behind the brick base. With this monument, Vasquez-Laroche conjures the Black body in an effort to render it visible, but the body eventually slips from him and disappears. The work addresses the labor of representation, the struggle for presence. It is also a potent reminder. The vanishing Black body and the remaining brick base underscore the reality that slavery is a foundation for many of our societies, but the enslaved and exploited are often invisible to us. This work attends to notions of inclusion and exclusion in the monumental narrative we call history. Within the context of new debates about monuments, this work constitutes what I consider radical representation, a practice that is closer to our textured experience with its many layers than a new statue in stone or bronze. Vasquez-Laroche's work pushes against what arts writer Jonathan Jones sees as a current tendency toward artistic conservatism. In a recent piece for The Guardian, Jones observes that the fall of racist monuments have been, and I quote, followed by a sterile conversation about who does and doesn't deserve a statue that adds nothing whatsoever to anyone's understanding of slavery, racism, or any other subject, end quote. Jones asks, why in the 21st century are we obsessing about putting up statues of new heroes to replace old villains? He goes further to advise, and I quote, instead of another statue, another token symbol, we could use the full scope of 21st century art to express both the nature of the slave trade and the impossibility of making art that can restore millions of stolen lives, end quote. I note Jones's use of possibility here, as I recall the title of Vasquez-Laroche's monument, Performance. By naming his work The Impossibility, Luis Vasquez-Laroche acknowledges his own wrestling with what monuments can and cannot accomplish. Other recent works by Caribbean artists point to ways of thinking about monuments in relation to the complexities or textures of our existence. Public interventions by Richard Mark Rollins destabilize monolithic values and narratives by injecting perspectives from the margins. In one performance, the artist stands before the Winston Churchill statue in Parliament Square, London. His stance is unapologetic as he superimposes his Black body on the sculpture. By positioning himself at this site, he erects a new structure in flesh, troubling the statue's materiality so that we are compelled to consider a relationship between blood and bronze, between the fluid and the fixed aspects of our world. As part of this public intervention, Rawlins reads from the book Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. In so doing, he recontextualizes the monument, literally opening its signification to new readings, to new interpretations. I must point out the artist's sagging pants and exposed underwear. He brings one of his earlier artworks into these public interventions. Just Black, Though Beat Up is a three-dimensional piece featuring denim pants sitting below the waist, coupled with black and white boxer shorts. Rawlins references a fashion trend most often seen among African Americans and other minority groups, a style adopted in the Caribbean. The sagging pants are emblematic of many ideas, including a resistance of mainstream values and an act of creative self-expression and freedom. To create the pattern on the boxer shorts, Rawlins converts the smiling emoji print found on the Joe Boxer brand of underwear. In his version, the faces are flat-mouthed. On the elastic waistband is a message communicated using Trinidad and Tobago vernacular, just black, though beat up. According to Rawlins, the statement means, this is just me doing my thing. No need to be worried. Go about your business. This message functions at a number of levels. It anticipates the way the black body is seen as a threat and invites the onlooker to stay calm. It reminds the viewer that to be just black is to be tied to a prevailing association with powerlessness. Yet, there is an irony at play. The sagging pants and boxer shorts facilitate a cutting performance as Rawlins uses his black body to challenge and subvert colonial ideologies. Standing before the Winston Churchill statue, he is more than just black or simply black. There are layers to his existence. He is textured. Finally, I want to speak about Jordi Hassel's work. The coronavirus pandemic has driven us to virtual domains, highlighting the fact that our textured experiences are not only informed by physical spaces. Hassel's Artifacts project constructs public monuments in cyberspace. Last year, the artist found a family tree her uncle had been researching for 8 years. This discovery inspired her to visit the archives in Bermuda to find more information about her family, but she was unsuccessful. Instead, she saw slave registers and old photographs of Afro-Bermudians. Seeing the artifacts prompted her to reflect on how little is known about slavery in her home country. In a recent interview with me, she shared, and I quote, "Much of the truth about the history of Bermuda's hand in slavery has been covered up. We don't learn about much of anything related to this Bermudian history in the education system. So there's a gap in understanding." End quote. Hassel has been collecting old photographs and digitally editing them to give them new life and erect what she describes as a monument of memory to those who have otherwise been forgotten or intentionally left out of history. Seeing the images as a collective allows us to discern multiple lives, multiple stories, and realities. Hassel offers a textured representation. Additionally, she grapples with time as a textured phenomenon as she explores the simultaneous workings of the past, present, and future, all encapsulated in her notion of art if facts. Art is a creative intersection with past images. If is a recognition of future implications of her present actions, and facts serve as a means for interrogating what is known and what is true now. Through tactics of recall and regeneration, the artist gives fresh perspective to the images in a creative move that signals notions of history and truth are about positionality, vantage points, and power. In closing, I return to my question: how might we engage practices of representation so that our public memory retains our textured experiences? Art by Jordi Hassel, Richard Mark Rawlins, and Louise Vasquez-Laroche offer examples of how we might see the work of representation in our unfolding context. Contemporary art in the Caribbean and its diaspora holds the potential to facilitate a reframing of how we see and understand monuments. With art, we can explore monuments as active sites for remembering the dynamics and intricacies of our societies, the nuances of meaning, the multidimensionality of our experiences. Thank you.
All right, so Camille is next. And Camille, you want me to go ahead and share the screen?
Sure, you can go ahead. Okay. The way we have been told our history has been affected. The way we have been told our history has affected the way we see and represent ourselves today. In primary and secondary schools in Jamaica, we are taught about the voyages of Christopher Columbus, who discovered the islands of the West Indies, even though those islands were already inhabited. This is a similar story taught in schools across the Americas, one of European conquest and domination, and the subjugation and death of people of colors. We are told of how civilization is a European gift brought into the New World. In my second year at Edna Manley College, however, I read the book They Came Before Columbus by Guyanese-born scholar Ivan Van Sertima. In the book, he provides evidence to suggest the presence of Africans in the New World long before Columbus, also implying advanced development in shipbuilding, navigation, art, and in general, their civilization. Van Sertima asserts his position on the African presence in Mesoamerican civilizations by looking at the colossal Olmec heads. Next slide. These pre-Columbian naturalistic heads date as far back as 900 BC. Each head is believed to represent and indeed commemorate a different ruler adorned in his own protective headgear. But their discovery has been puzzling. To date, 17 of these stone heads have been found buried, removed from their original contexts. Some were even found to have been vandalized. It is believed that their burial and defacement is attributed to subsequent rulers attempting to legitimize their authority while neutralizing the dead ruler's power. Essentially, these were monuments which also served as containers for the soul. They were buried, like many of the histories we in the Caribbean are slowly unearthing, even in this year alone. The idea of the soul residing in statues and monuments is also something the ancient Egyptians believed in. So when a statue or image was vandalized, it was done with the intent to deactivate an image's strength. Unlike the militant presence of the massive Olmec heads, African-American artist Carol Walker's 2014 subtlety was grand, yet precarious. Walker created this temporary site-specific installation at the Domino's Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, New York. The piece comprised of the monumental Mammy Sphinx made of carved foam blocks which had been covered in white refined sugar. And this was accompanied by 15 enlarged versions of blackamoors made in China. The piece made reference to the transatlantic slave trade, sugar plantations of the Caribbean, capitalism, industry, mythologies, and racist stereotypes. Next slide. The Mammy figure was the centerpiece of the audience's attraction as the piece went viral on social media. Viewers, excited by the temporality of the piece, made their way to catch a look at the spectacle. They wanted to see it and be seen with it. Next slide. The title of the piece, A Subtlety, refers to small edible sugar sculptures featured during the Middle Ages at English and French elite dinner parties when sugar was a luxury commodity. Cara's subtlety is indeed intended for consumption, for audiences to feast their eyes on the figure's caricatured naked exposure, and to vandalize it via virtual touch, thereby further weakening an already vulnerable depiction of a Black figure. Next slide. Similarly, acts of sexual objectification have been made on the Redemption Song Monument here in Kingston. The piece was created by Laura Facey Cooper in 2003 to uproars about the figure's nakedness. Although the artist's intent was to represent a prayerful meditation on the figure's emancipation, they have instead been likened by some to being on the auction block as they stand in the sun looking up to the sky with their arms sealed to their sides, their feet buried in a cement pool, static, immobile, unfree. Next slide. And the piece became more problematic after a second work by the artist saw the placement of smaller versions of the monument in the canoe atop sugarcane, a gesture which seemed to place the figures back into the ship which they were emancipated from by the very artist who made them to begin with. And there have been other works where the miniatures are placed in different scenarios. It could be said that these emancipated figures suddenly transformed into toys. Next slide. Just as visitors did to Kara Walker's subtlety, so they have done to the Redemption Song Monument. As a result of these interventions, the Redemption Song Monument seems to honor these Black bodies as exposed industrial machines rather than celebrate the end of the figure's enslavement. Next slide. In making monuments, therefore, we must be careful not only of how we represent history, but also of whose side of history we choose to represent. In Orlando Patterson's book, An Absence of Ruins, he suggests that the idea that we as an African diaspora don't have our own ruins, we have European ruins. Ruins being the leftovers of a past that can still be cherished. In the Caribbean, ruins generally become heritage sites because of the value that is conferred upon these places. Heritage sites serve the purpose of being monuments, and they have even greater damaging histories than the statues we so heavily debate today. These memorialized locations are sites of violence, bloodshed, and death of a people who have largely gone unacknowledged. They are memorialized from one side of history. Over the past few weeks, for instance, I've been following the disturbing story from journalists and researchers, Vereen Shepherd, Tana Thomas, Dr. Ahmed Reed, and others, behind a song I sang for 7 years of my upbringing. When I attended the Hampton School in Malvern St. Elizabeth, which is high school, I, like most of the other girls at the school, had no idea what we praised when we sang the words, "To educate demands great care, so honor much the worthy pair, who gave their means and nobly planned to train the youths of this fair land, so loudly let your praises flow to Dickinson and Hugh Monroe." Robert Hugh Monroe and Caleb Dickinson were slavers, and they formed a trust which led to the creation of Hampton School and Monroe College. Trustees received £6,831 in compensation for 346 enslaved Africans on October of 1835. Hampton, like Monroe, is a heritage site, and so are many of our other Jamaican high schools with a very similar history. While this information doesn't remove the education and opportunities that thousands of people have benefited from at these institutions, it is still important for us to know the full history of what we commemorate. Such as my high school song had texts that have now been placed under scrutiny, as well as my parents' childhood song, God Save the Queen. America's Star-Spangled Banner has a third stanza that has again reignited debate on hidden histories. This is where we find some of the worst kinds of erasing as a means to sanitize. These texts stand as verbal monuments in and of themselves, and it is in the immateriality of these mere words we find some of the most violent proclamations. Next slide. In 2019, Iana Tico Garcia represented Jamaica in the Miss Universe pageant. For her national costume, she proudly wore the outfit titled Annie Palmer, Legend of Rose Hall, to much controversy. The problem of not being aware of our history leads to things like this, which is a Black woman wearing a costume representing Annie Palmer, who was a woman who enslaved Black people. And those Black people's ancestors represent the majority of our population today. However, the Miss Universe Jamaica organization said that they chose to highlight, oh, you can put the next slide up. They chose to highlight a tourism icon and national treasure from the tourism capital. With this year's costume, we never sought to glorify slavery nor promote witchcraft or any of the folk tales Annie Palmer has been accused of. Instead, what we sought to do, as have the pantomimes, books, and articles written about her, was to just tell the story of another part of Jamaican history without endorsing, glorifying, or celebrating her deeds or the atrocities of slavery. The organizers felt that they could present one aspect of Annie Palmer's history and ignore the other. And it is exactly this selective vision that has led to issues in how we represent ourselves, because we have been taught to embrace the story of Black oppression and subjugation as a matter of fact and nothing to really think about, nothing to be troubled with. I think that statement encapsulates what so many of the statues and monuments of Cecil Rhodes, Lord Nelson, Christopher Columbus, Queen Victoria, and more have attempted to do. They've sadly attempted to highlight national treasures while omitting and misrepresenting the complete story. Next slide. Added to that, the way Rose Hall Estate is represented on the Jamaica National Heritage Trust website is one of celebration of Annie Palmer as a cruel slave owner, while talking about, you know, this lovely attraction where you can get some snacks and gifts at the shop, you know, and it's talking about it like it's a real estate commercial. So who is this site for? Next slide. History and heritage are very important aspects of my practice, as I am also trying to get a full picture of the heritage and people that have been lost and which I can share with new audiences. In 2014 to 15, I made Wholesale Degradables, which was an installation featuring the painted portraits of men and women killed by police in Jamaica. The piece also featured other veiled individuals in an overlapping of histories. Black people killed by their state powers in their times under circumstances of slavery and abuse. Some of the veiled figures included Congolese rubber workers who were tortured under Leopold II of Belgium in the 1800s, Truganini, who was said to be the last full-blooded Tasmanian who suffered abuses under European conquests, and the Herero people of Namibia who were wiped out in the first genocide of the 20th century waged by the German Empire. Next slide. If we don't know our history, we may continue to embrace the things that do not serve us. In 2016, I started a series of charcoal drawings featuring broken Black bodies with cement blocks, thinking about those blocks as symbols of this very one-sided history I've spoken of. We have seen the images of women dance in dance hall abusing themselves with cement blocks. Incidentally, the thing we use to construct our spaces, our heritage, our understanding of ourselves has become the thing which destroys us. Next slide. In 2017, I went to Scotland, and while there, I found red clay bricks washed up on the beach and could trace a number of them all the way back to the Caribbean, as some of those manufacturers sent bricks to construct sugar plantations during the slave trade. Scotland was able to supply bricks to construct Appleton Estate here in Jamaica, as well as Sunbury Plantation in Barbados, an extension of the wealth they made from the slave trade. Cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh are only recently coming to terms with their heritage sites and the links to slavery. Right. Next slide. So should we remove statues of former colonizers who represent the progress they made for their homelands and their culture, yet secretly stand as reminders of slavery and a racist system in our societies? Next slide. I think I am still thinking about these things, and I am still trying to work through them in my own work and my own practice. How do I see myself in relation to these blocks, these walls that form one side of an idea of our heritage? I think removal of these monuments can also mean an erasure and a forgetting from history that these atrocities happened. We have no ruins of our own, so we are also dealing with our own erasure. The statues can be removed from their plinths, but what must happen is an acknowledgement of brutal actions that were enforced against entire civilizations. There needs to be large plaques that explain these histories. There needs to be orientation, for instance, at my former high school. When students come into the school, they need to be educated about these former histories that I am only learning about today. And while there have been many calls for abstraction in art communities, in the art community as an alternative to what has become traditional statue format, I am wary of the prospect of erasure through academic dispositions. It's for everyone, and although abstraction might seem like an inclusive and less offensive proposition, I think it might not clearly solve the issue. And the idea that figurative representation is a European construct, well, you only have to look back at the Olmec heads to see that that's not the case. There's, I think I have an image of a monument here by Paul Ramirez. I think it's in the sculpture part that Jairi said you're gonna have some work in soon, the Socrates sculpture part.
I had work in 2018. Okay,
right. So I don't mind, you know, this kind of format and some of the works that Marsha, you showed as a format for monuments, but I also do want to see heroes, you know, I want to see our heroes represented as well. I think it's really important that we can see ourselves in that kind of way. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Camille. So our next presenter is Rosa. Rosa, unmute. Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. Good morning, and I want to thank the entire team at the University of West Indies Museum and Diaspora Vibe Cultural Arts Incubator for inviting me to this conversation. I'm very happy to be among like-minded artists and scholars, and some of which I've just met through this conversation. Let me take this out of the way a minute, sorry. I want to begin by acknowledging the land of the indigenous peoples of South Florida, Miami, where I live and work now. This is the traditional land of the Tequesta, one of the first peoples of this region. And acknowledging land rights of indigenous people is especially important, I think, in the context of the conversation that we're having today. The conversation around structural racism, inequality, colonialism, and settler colonialism, which is at the core of the founding of the United States. Also, equally important for me is to acknowledge in this conversation that it has been 12 weeks since George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis. We've witnessed and been part of a tremendous public outcry for Black lives across the United States that has spread beyond its borders. 2020 has ushered in what many call the two pandemics, and it's a time of reckoning here in the United States. And it's within this context that I want to share with you Rituals of Commemoration, which I have been working on since 2014, and more recently as a public memory project. A defining moment in my life as an artist and a cultural producer was ignited the night that I heard Michael Brown was killed by police. He was 18 years old, and he was killed in broad daylight a few minutes after noon, and he was left in the street for hours. This was August 9th, 2014. And Ferguson changed me. It pushed me to question myself. What can I do? What is my role as an artist? The genesis of this commemoration project began that night. And ever since then, I've been focused on documenting the names of Black men, women, and youth killed by police or security guards in the United States, beginning in the year 1979 up to the present. Over 1,300 lives lost. These two installations from 2016 have about 200 plus paved stone bricks. Bricks seems to be a connecting line for a lot of this work. Each brick is painted and individualized by inscribing and recording the name and the year each person was killed. The bricks are made of concrete. They are durable, readily available, and it's a non-precious material. Some iterations include PowerPoint presentations with photographs, names, and dates, and brief facts about the atrocities and the human being killed. Some of the gallery installations are site-specific, like the image on the right. And more recently, the iterations include wallpapered background with a similar brick design and column formations instead of a wall. Unfortunately, the documentation of murdered lives is ongoing. This project has led me to envision Rituals of Commemoration as a public memory project, a space holder, a memory legacy that will ensure that the names of victims of police killings are not forgotten, giving the lives lost dignity and respect by creating a public physical space of remembrance and a symbolic acknowledgement of a difficult present. This is part of the conversation taking place across the United States and in the Caribbean and Latin America and Europe. And it's part of the discussions here in the United States regarding police brutality, systematic racism, inequality, poverty, and the school to prison pipeline. So I've been investigating and researching, asking myself and others about monuments, memorials, and public spaces in our communities. I have been looking at how this is approached in different parts of the United States, the Caribbean, and the global South. How do we define monuments? What's the purpose of a public monument? Who should be memorialized or honored? Who decides what to remember in public spaces? Should there be a consultation process with the community? What should these structures or spaces look like? And when is it the right time, if ever, to commemorate? In the United States, we're in the middle of a long reckoning over the monuments we have inherited, as I think is happening as by our previous conversation in many places. Because monuments usually operate as statements of power and presence in public spaces. But we've also witnessed a sea change around monuments. Scholars in the United States cite two places as the most important and gripping sites of memory here. One is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which I'm sharing with you here. So, you know, as an artist, how do you build a monument to a war that was more tragic than triumphant? Maya Lin was a young architect when her design was selected to become the Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And her design was just as controversial as the war itself. Some saw it as an anti-war statement. Others wondered why an Asian American should be the designer. Inscribed in the memorial are the names of service members classified as declared dead. There are also the names of individuals who died in other circumstances, like murder, vehicle accidents, drowning, heart attack, and others. It also includes the names of those whose status is unknown, typically means missing in action. So the initial hostility has faded now, and the monument has become quite a treasured piece of public sculpture. Just for our common knowledge and remembering, the Vietnam War started in 1955 and it ended in 1975. And this memorial was done in 1982, almost 20 years later. I also, the second site is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It opened to the public on April 2018. It's this nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color who are burdened with the contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. This is an ongoing project in the effort to reshape the cultural landscape with monuments and memorials that more truthfully and accurately reflect the history of the United States. I was able to visit both of these sites as part of my research. There are 800 6-foot steel monuments that are engraved. They symbolize thousands of racial terror lynching victims in the United States and the counties and states where this terrorism took place. For me, I think this is one of the projects here that's at the vanguard of this current era of truth-telling about racial injustice. This effort in Montgomery is led by the Equal Justice Initiative. It was founded in 1989 by Brian Stevenson, who is widely known as a lawyer and is the best-selling author of Just Mercy. This is a private nonprofit organization. Controversy about public monuments and public art are happening everywhere in the modern and contemporary world, and I'm glad it was talked about earlier by Camille, more specifically, since you live and work in Jamaica. I've been visiting countries in the Caribbean for the last few years, Suriname, Guadeloupe, with Jasper Vibe Cultural Arts Incubator as cultural exchange programs. I'm Cuban, and I visit Cuba also and work there. So, you know, it's clear that we have similar challenges. And I remember visiting the studio of Laura Faces and learning about the controversy about this particular sculpture, Redemption Song at Emancipation Park. You know, part of what we share, the challenges that we share are, you know, how artists are selected. Who decides? What is the process? Are competitions really blind? Why are some artists always excluded? You know, these systematic practices of exclusion. Who should and who should not be honored? When is it the right time? So these are questions we are all grappling with in many places. And as artists, we also, society as a whole. In my research, I have also been looking at the Global South, specifically remembrance practices developed in Chile that are tied to a process of symbolic reparations program, which are the result of decades of struggle by family and descendants of the over 40,000 murdered, tortured, imprisoned, and disappeared by the military during Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. There are 6 monuments and memorials that are part of the Human Rights Program, which bears responsibility for truth, justice, memory, and acts of symbolic reparation. I'm showing 2 images here. This process began in the 1980s. The memorials are part of a set of measures to which the relatives of the victims are entitled. These are intended to repair the damage caused during the military dictatorship in Chile. Some of the measures take the shape of pensions, scholarships for children of the tortured or missing, healthcare, human rights care, and waiver of the service in the military. For me, I think this process is very interesting. It's an example of how remembrance and monuments have been born out of concrete struggles of communities who have been affected most. And in Miami, where I live and work, I've been researching and visiting memorial sites, statues, and plaques across the city. Miami-Dade County is made up of mostly immigrant population from the Caribbean and Latin America. We have almost 3 million people who live in Miami-Dade County. And the city is dotted by monuments that speak to selected groups of the city's constituents. Some of the monuments reflect racist and unjust legacies. Recently, I've been at 2 large protests at some of the city's historical monuments in support for Black lives. Here on the left side, it's an image of the Torch of Freedom in downtown Miami. And it was one of the sites of hundreds of people gathered during the protests. This is in downtown Miami. Another site and another protest I've been part of was in Little Haiti. It's a neighborhood, it's part of the city of Miami. And the site is a monument to Toussaint Louverture. It was commissioned by the city of Miami in 2005. It's a larger than life bronze statue of the founding father of Haiti. The park is not very big, occupying a sort of an irregular wedge of land that would have been difficult to develop to begin with. They're going through a whole gentrification that's happening there for the last couple of years. It was designed and sculpted by James Maston, who's a North American sculptor who's known for these sort of commemorating significant historical events and individuals. So I've shared with you some, but not all, of the research that is informing my current approach. I'm in the process now of constituting a diverse and intersectional group made up of local cultural producers, writers, activists, scholars, students, architects, and municipal agencies on the front lines of the conversation on racial justice, to explore the development of ideas and designs for this new public memory project that I am involved in at downtown Miami. A design that is open and inviting for people to gather. It should become a place of learning as well as a place of healing, designed to reach multiple constituencies, including those directly affected by providing access to aesthetic that support identity while making a community feel appreciated and valued. I wanna create some meetups, Zoom meetups to engage the communities that care about what this memory project could stand for, organize events at some possible sites, have a conversation, basically, that's led by an artist, myself, but including others. This group or committee will explore stories and critical conversations around the past, present, and the future of monuments in the city, explore design ideas and proposals. It's a long-term, ambitious process that will be affected by the ongoing struggle for racial justice. I think artists can take the lead in reclaiming and renaming public spaces, and it's already happening in some places. There's been a shift in society. I don't think that it can be business as usual. Artists can be agents of change in the process of confronting, examining, and dismantling the various structures that brought us to this point as a society. But artists cannot do this alone because we serve a broader community and we have social responsibility that is larger than ourselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Rosa. So our next speaker, our last speaker is Jordy.
Hello, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen. So I want to thank Shani Roper and the University of the West Indies Museum for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of this exciting conversation. My name is Jordi Minaya. I'm an interdisciplinary visual artist born in the US and raised in the Dominican Republic. And I'm now living in New York. So are you seeing, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see this, but I took it out of the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so Um, my work is a reassertion of self, an exercise in unlearning, decolonizing, and exercising imposed histories, cultures, and ideas. I wanted to start with the work that you're seeing in the screen, a series of photos and performances called Containers, because it's the catalyst, um, for subsequent works, including my work around monuments. In Containers, I construct bodysuits out of spandex fabric printed with commercial tropical motifs and sewn in specific forms that force the performance to then embody specific poses that came from a Google search for Dominican women. In this way, meditating on the idea of inhabiting a predetermined or pre-imagined space as women in or from tropical geographies. This is a photo of the one of the performances. And in the performances, there are other elements that deal with labor and um, a performativity in different ways. So the performer is wearing this bodysuit and taking it off, on and off, based on an audio track that has a script. There is also a spandex installation series that extrapolates these ideas onto architectural space, using tropical printed spandex to create halls, walls, labyrinths, and immersive areas, dividing or obstructing space, and often demanding the viewer to lower their body or um, move in unusual ways to enter the space, in gestures that echo ideas of adventure, humility, or discomfort. By intervening the space in this manner and making people crawl under, jump, or struggle with the fabric to access and see the rest of the exhibition. Um, sorry, I'm trying to, okay. And see the rest of the exhibition. The installation aims to reflect on the experience of locals in places where tourist industries have created exclusive spaces that locals can no longer access. I often pair these installations with the film Labadee, which is a short film documenting parts of a Royal Caribbean uh, cruise trip to Labadee, Haiti, and the dynamics of exclusion that unfold in this privately managed, fenced-off beach, which is leased to Royal Caribbean until 2050, since 1980. The subtitles begin with text from Columbus's diary when they first see land, and later recounts the trip seen on the screen. It is in this context that I did the first proposal for wrapping the statue of Christopher Columbus in Nassau in the Bahamas. I was invited by Holly Bino and Amanda Colson to do an exhibition alongside artist Didi Brown at the National Gallery in the Bahamas through their program named Double Dutch, where they pair a Bahamian artist with an artist from the broader Caribbean diaspora. This exhibition was to be open on October 12, 2017. Taking into consideration this date, celebrated as the day that Christopher Columbus discovered America, and the work that I was doing at the time, I proposed to wrap the Columbus statue in Nassau, in front of the governor's house, as a temporary installation and as an extension of the process I presented on those previous works, re-signifying this containment into a statue onto public space and national identity, transforming it from covering and uncovering women's bodies, protesting exotification and otherness in relation to nature, to then highlighting and questioning colonial remnants in our present, particularly in, but not limited to, touristic and commemorative sites. The spandex covering would have blurred the detailed bronze statue into an amorphous, strange form, while calling attention to their presence in the city through colorful, hypertropical patterns. However, the Antiquities and Monuments Division of the National Museum of the Bahamas was unable to support my artistic intervention because they found that there wasn't enough time for issuing the permit, but they also said that there had not been a national conversation on the matter, which was something curious for me to hear. I decided to make postcards with a Photoshop montage of what my installation would have looked like, which is this image that you see here, and invited the Bahamian audience that came to the exhibition to write in the back of the postcards their thoughts on the proposal. In this way, starting and recording a national conversation. So these are some of the postcards that I think we had something like 80, and there's about 9 here. I'm going to read the one in the middle, which is my favorite. Dominance concealed by tropical beauty, perhaps the statue is a reminder of the political reality we are subject to. And then there's all sorts of opinions from you can't change history to cover the fuckers. So it's a pretty diverse documentation of people's opinions. That was the first instance of this ongoing series, but later in 2019, I did get to wrap a statue of Christopher Columbus in Miami, and not only Columbus, but also Ponce de Leon. Another prominent colonizer in Spanish-speaking Caribbean, after whom a Puerto Rican city is named, and so many other things like streets and institutions. This was thanks to a commission by Fringe Projects Miami, which is a nonprofit that does temporary public art installations. The main difference with this intervention is that while in the other works that I presented before, I was appropriating tropical print that was commercially available in an attempt to recontextualize and question this product and the overabundance of this product in contemporary culture. In this instance, I designed my own patterns based on research on ethnobotany and identifying plants that were important to the people who survived the colonial systems implemented by the figures that the statues celebrate. Using tropical pattern as a critical medium, I was interested in connecting the commodification of the tropical flora and the legacy of colonization, evidencing how this deceptively innocuous, mass-produced tropical prints flatten Caribbean identity and erase specific histories of colonialism. For the patterns of the cloaking series, I was researching specifically plants used by Native American, Black, and Afro-Caribbean traditions as metaphors of resistance, plants with a poison healing or poison defense duality, and traditions of purging, cleansing, casting evil spirits away, or protection. I was interested in material uses of chemicals presented in the plants, as well as spiritual beliefs in relation to plants. The design for the Ponce de Leon statue, which is the one that you're seeing here, is based on the manchineel tree, a holder of the Guinness World Record of the most dangerous poisonous tree. The Calusa, one of the original Florida native tribes, used this tree to poison the arrow that ended up killing Ponce de Leon. The Calusa resisted colonization in their territory for approximately 200 years, forcing the Spanish to settle in other areas of Florida first, like the Tequesta, which was mentioned by Rosa. This design also features kunti leaves, which is a palm-like leaf. It's a palm-like leaf plant that has a root that was used by the natives to make bread out of, similar to how we use cassava in the Caribbean. It was one of their main crops, thus important for sustenance. This is me in the studio making the pattern. So part of my practice also has to do with analyzing the designs of these mass-produced patterns to mimic that those visuals, because it's still a commentary on the production of those patterns. The main plant in the pattern designed for covering the statue of Christopher Columbus is the castor plant. Castor is a plant brought to the Americas by enslaved people who had the knowledge of how to process the plant for many medical applications in spite of its toxicity. Castor has high amounts of ricin, a potent toxin, all over the plant. And successfully distilling non-toxic parts of the plant and using them for healing once the ricin was left behind is part of that knowledge. The other plants on this design are Yopon holly, used by several. Oh, here's a painting of my version of castor next to one of these botanical illustrations. And maybe I should pause to mention here that part of my idea with using the aesthetics of these botanical illustrations has to do with the awareness that they were once used for as tools of the empire and of the colonial enterprise, in how they were tools for assessing newfound resources that were later capitalized on. So my intention of using them in these interventions has to do with kind of using the same languages that were used for oppression in order to challenge these symbols that we still have today. So I was saying that other plants on that design are yopon holly, used by several Native American tribes, including the ones in South Florida for purging rituals, and rompesaragüey, used widely in Yoruba-derived religions for cleansing and despojos, which translates to kind of dispossession or riddance of unwanted energy. And rompesaragüey is particularly popular in Cuba also. Yeah, so I'm gonna pause this here with a photo of Ponce de Leon being wrapped in on Biscayne Boulevard in front of the Torch of Friendship. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I think this has been just really a very informative and engaging panel. I mean, they really covered the breadth of discussions around the monuments, ranging from thinking about monuments in the Caribbean to what it looks like in the global south and what it looks like in the United States. I think we have a really good base to think a little bit more about some of the questions that came up, which are really questions about which tools an artist uses and which histories we choose to engage, or rather the perspective of the history. I think I think this moment, this global pandemic and the issues and what the pandemic revealed about structural and social and cultural inequalities has really brought this to the forefront. So I would like my panelists, and you can really, choose who would want to go first, is how do you think the mode that the artist uses, as well as, well, let's go with mode. Do you think the mode is the most important thing, or do you think that the dialogue around the mode chosen by the artist is important? Or rather, this works out to be 3 questions, or do we need conversations with our stakeholders in engaging artistic practice in public spaces? Any one of you can jump.
I think, to use Marsha's word, textured, I think we're so diverse as artists that I don't know if this can be pinned down to one type of recommendation as to how, what mode we should represent monuments in going forward. So, I mean, it was mentioned about having blind Rosa, you mentioned like blind commissions for choosing artists for to do monuments, and sometimes that doesn't necessarily work. So I mean, things need to be shifted. The approaches need to be shifted, but I also think the conversations about who we choose to monumentalize, or the information is definitely really important to be put out there about what we monumentalize, how we do it, and there are various approaches. So I was saying that I do really like, for example, Vasquez's work that you showed, Marsha, and how that is such a temporary thing, but it's such a very important commentary on a situation. Whereas I also do really like the more traditional format, which is something that lives on with us, not forever, because now we can see that even those kinds of structures are not temporary either, because they're being taken down. So yeah, I think it's really open.
Yeah. Just to piggyback on what you were saying, Camille, I think my point was really for us to think about a more expanded definition or understanding of monuments, and so that we are not thinking in rigid terms, we're not restricted to understanding them simply as figurative or literal representations, but to open that up a little more so that there can be room for all of these forms of representation. But to answer Shani's question, I think it's not so much about an either or in terms of whether it's mode or it's conversation. I think those work in concert. And it's really about, exploring both. How does mode trigger conversation? How does conversation intersect with modality? So I think it's both.
Okay. So I thought another important point that Marsha really liked the use of texture, but I also think the important discussion is one about content, I think. How do we, because what Jordi does in her work is actually break down the histories of materials, right? And this discussion, I think, also includes the production of materials that we view as West African, and the fact that they're not necessarily produced on the continent, but rather it's produced in Europe and in China, and the discussion about who controls the artistic license around fashioning, right? So I like the idea of the use of the colonial history of botany to then have these broader discussions about colonial context. But so much of this too is about which information we use, right? And how accessible the information is. And I don't think people would have known about the colonial histories of traditional high schools in Jamaica if we weren't having the current debates about monuments, right? And so I think, what role do you think history education plays in dismantling legacies of colonialism, and this may be within an artistic practice, one, and then the second, we have a question here about permanence, the idea of permanent around monuments and public spaces. Has the idea of a permanent visual art item, or the idea rather that a visual art item should be permanent in the practice of monumentalization? So just, whichever one you guys want to answer first.
Can you see me? Sorry.
Yeah.
I had to jump on my phone. Sorry, I had some technical issues with the computer, but I wanted to speak to the permanence, given that my interventions are impermanent. And just say that I don't necessarily do that by choice, but just using what I have access to in the moment. And that's part of something that I'm aware of, is that at the end of the day, this spandex temporary intervention is not going to outlive the bronze. So that's also a conversation that has to do with institutional power and wealth, and who has the resources to support what proposals and which ideas and which communities. I don't know if they should be permanent or not. I think traditionally they have been, and I think there's value in both approaches, because at the end of the day, societies are going to evolve and have different values. So the idea of something from the past existing and still being part of the conversation could be problematic. And then at the same time, we also have the issue of remembrance. I think the question will be more how to choose what we remember and who are the voices that are going to be heard when we're talking about that choice.
I wanted to comment on this. For example, in Miami, there's a public arts program where artists present proposals for monuments, public art in general, memorials, anything that's public art. And it's difficult to get into that process. It's not necessarily open and transparent, or the question of accessibility is a big question. You know, also you need permits to go into public spheres. So you can't, unless you're doing something sort of like guerrilla style. You do it at night, you come in and you leave sort of thing. So there are limitations, as Jordi mentioned, by the institutions. In my research, I've been reading about Monument Lab in Philadelphia, and they have been going through a whole process since 2017 that I find really interesting, because they're talking a lot and they've invited artists, community. They've done a really broad project, really focusing on getting the information of the communities and the different voices, and also analyzing the monuments that exist there now and the temporary monuments. You know, I think there's room for everything. I think the most difficult question is that because of the systems of power we've inherited, voices are left out of the conversation and histories are left out. Miami is a very complicated place. We have, you know, folks from, it's a segregated city. We have pockets of every country in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe, and several Europe in the city. So who makes the decisions and whose lives are valued versus other lives? So it's very complex. And I think this has been really helpful to keep thinking. It's not something we're gonna resolve. I think it's gonna take time and process, and this kind of conversations that are broader, that include, you know, regular folks.
Well, okay, so let me ask Marsha and Camille though, so while this is the issue in Miami, which it's very segregated, and there's, I think, a particular kind of structured approach to who gets the access, there are these institutional issues around who accesses public spaces and what public spaces can be reinterpreted. But for Marsha and Camille, do you think both in the Trinidadian and Jamaican context that these are issues that affect an artist's practice or affect the democratization of the memorialization of, or democratization of monument practice? Or artist practice? You guys can tell me what you think. Marsha, you want to go first?
In terms of access, I wanted to build on the last question regarding permanence and ephemeral. What is ephemeral? And I mean, I'm in a context where, you know, we have Carnival every year. Carnival has a certain monumentality. It has a certain kind of scale. And again, in terms of expanding how we understand monuments, it could be argued that Carnival is an annual ephemeral monument, you know, that occurs again and again, you know, that is constructed at a certain time in a certain way. And so we have to ask perhaps, you know, In what context and for what purpose do we require permanence? When is it more important to have something that lives and die at a particular time, only to sort of rise again at another occasion? So I think those kinds of questions also have to be factored into whether we're thinking, that permanence or impermanence is discredited or not. I think we really have to think about the context of the form. And again, what we consider to be monuments when we think about monumentality. In terms of access, I liked that question about whether certain artists are excluded from, processes of decision-making and representation. That seems to be, plaguing our societies in the artistic sphere in terms of who gets to speak and who remains silenced. And again, that is at the core of representation. Can we represent everything? It's always about selection. It's always about choice. And so who makes those choices? Why, when, and so on? All of those things factor into questions, about access and visibility and so on. If Camille wants to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's been that issue with Mark Quinn in Bristol, where he put up a statue overnight, and it became this real big problem because he's a white artist trying to take over space, and he didn't go through any real process to have that kind of access to that type of space. That was where they had just removed Colson's statue from. So, and I think that happens here in the Caribbean in terms of, everything Marsha just said in terms of basically gatekeeping and, who gets access to what. And I think here in Jamaica, we do have a lot of monuments, and a lot have been going up in recent times, particularly of athletes. Well, those are statues of athletes and Miss Lou and so on, and that's really good. I think we can have more. Once we start to really dig into the issues of heritage, for instance, with Rose Hall, the fact that was kind of dismissed. That whole situation was dismissed with the Annie Palmer situation as just one side of a story that they wanted to tell. I think we still need to come to terms with some of those histories before we can even decide what we are going to make monuments to.
I agree with you. I think one of the discussions that happens around heritage, and just my own little intervention here, is that the problem with the tourist product around the Great House is that it doesn't provide the full dimension of the Great House, i.e. that the enslaved village is almost always within seeing range of the Great House. But if you tour a Great House, you don't actually get to see anything about the enslaved presence, and the enslaved presence actually gets wiped out, and which is bizarre given that we are a Black majority context. And I think that there is something to be said about the ideological processes around how we construct tourism products, right? And what are the philosophies of who gets highlighted. And I'm thinking of Tracy Ann Wynne-Hale's work here, her dissertation work on the representation around the tourism product, and that Black bodies, especially for tourism in the Caribbean, and we're all tourism dependent economies, most of us are rather in the region, that we're always positioned in service of. And so we replicate these images around, the police officer in the shorts and the hat that you see it in the Bahamas, actually, right? That these are the products that we offer tourism. So we have some comments coming in from Facebook, from Bearly Poupée. Her comment is, I find it fascinating that public monuments are traditionally among the most ignored and taken for granted forms of art. And now they've been turned into sites of active engagement and creative intervention. Given the vast divide that generally exists between contemporary art practice and general audiences, I'm very interested in what can be learned from the present moment in terms of strategies of engagement. Any of you want to respond to that, or?
I wanted to talk about the previous question, and I also have thoughts about this, but I'll might take a minute to put them together. But I just wanted to say that when you asked about the question of access and whether that discussion was different in countries in the Caribbean that maybe were more homogenous than, say, Miami, that has all of these different groups that have to agree. I think this is an issue of white supremacy still in the Caribbean and how it's manifested there as well, because growing up in the DR, I can tell you that even though we have a more homogeneous society, we still have an overproliferation of monuments, institutions, and narratives that highlight some parts of the history and omit other parts of the history based on what is the narrative that they want to push forward, what is the idea of identity that they want to project onto the nation, whether that corresponds with our actual lived experience or not. So yeah, I think it definitely manifests differently, but you still have at the core the same ideology moving the strings, maybe.
Okay, any other comments about engagement strategies? I'll just move on to the next statement, which is by Dean Arlen. The artist must be very aware of their politics if we want to dismantle, decolonize funding, both private and from the state. How we practice in studio and how we spend our funding in the community obviously plays a very important role in this practice. The next one is from Franz Everett. We are mainly from African or Indian ancestry. I think he's speaking more specifically about the Caribbean, but these new world orders have made it hard for people to unite and make a sensible life for people. And I think this has some implication about, for example, who gets selected in a process. And so he goes on to ask, what are former colonies doing within these within our spaces? Okay, so how are former colonies or / new nations responding to monuments that are left behind? So I suppose he's referring to our colonial legacies and how we respond to them. I don't know if any of you would like to respond to any of those statements.
I think I briefly mentioned just some ideas about how to deal with, those types of monuments. Maybe I think they might be referring to, statues and so on of Victoria and Columbus and so on. And based on just this whole discussion here, and taking into account what Verily was asking about engagement, I think there are so many things that can be done, and whether it is having interactions with those types of works in a way or format that Jairi, for instance, is doing, and educational programming around that as well, where you can have students doing some kind of installation and research around it, and I mean students from all ages can start to learn these things, because a lot of young students, high school age, don't really know any of this, as much as we are even talking about it now. I think sometimes they can be a bit oblivious to the concerns that we currently have. So educational programming that is fairly art-based, so it's more unconventional. It's not just I'm sitting in a classroom reading about a history. It's more of maybe taking students into situations where they have to interact with statues or monuments and discover new ways of learning from them and learning more about them. And then of course there's the whole idea of taking the statues down and putting them in museums and having broader discussions about them, more wall text that explores the more of a fulsome picture of them. You can do documentaries about them, you can do all kinds of interventions.
Okay, so you think the issue is really to change how we engage narratives then? I think that's what the consensus is, right? That the role of the artist in this case is to provide, well, okay, one of the roles of an artist rather is to provide this new space to or change the ways in which we engage different stories around representation. I think, is that it? Do we all agree on that then?
Sure, Shani, I wanted to return to Verly's comment and her question, and it's not separated from what we have been talking about here. But I think in terms of this context in which we're talking about, dismantling white supremacy and we're reckoning with racial injustice and so on, I think this moment is also an opportunity for us to reckon with elitism when it comes to art and how we perceive our perceptions of art and who thinks they have access to that and who feels that, they
Absolutely.
And so we not only ask, what is art, but we also have to ask, where is art, and so art is not only within the white cube, it's not only within the museum space or the gallery space where a lot of our society feels that is not the place for them, or, they can't understand art, they feel separated from it. So I think this moment allows us to really sort of bridge that divide between contemporary art and audiences, for us to reconfigure how we understand monuments as artworks, and for us to begin to engage publicly, perhaps in concert with the museum space or the gallery space, but to also see the public space as a place of valid and meaningful engagement with artworks that can be accessible to more people.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add something to that. I'm glad you raised that, Marsha, because yes, a lot of, many of our societies where we live and work, art is sort of for a minority, really, through the institutions of museums and galleries, is not for the general public. I had an experience in 2012. I went to Santiago de Cuba to a mural biennial. It was a month-long event, and artists from all over the world really went, about 40 artists, 6 different languages, and the process was very interesting to me. It was a month long. The first 2 days, all the artists met, all the conversations were translated to incorporate the French speaking, the English speaking, Spanish speaking, of course. And we spent a couple of days debating and deciding upon the theme of the mural. We visited 6 different sites that included parks and schools, sides of buildings. And then we spent a week in individual groups. For example, I worked on the mural for a school, an elementary school, making designs and talking about what kind of imagery would express our theme that we had all voted on. After that, the third week, we took the sketches to a plaza in downtown Santiago, where cultural institutions, galleries, the general public came and listened and took part in the process of the presentations by the artist for conversation. And it's not a perfect system, but it was the first time that I was part of a more open conversation that included different levels of society in the decision-making of what was gonna go in the neighborhood, whether it was the school, whether it was the park in the corner, the side of the building. And I think that sometimes, artists we work in isolation a bit. And societies are like, you're special people with special, attributes. And I think it would serve us better for myself to be more embedded in the cities, the societies, the conversations that where we live and where we work, and make it more democratic process and involve and collaborate with other people. I think, especially when we're talking about public art, I think that's something that has to happen. Our studio practice and the work that we design for other spaces, and I think are different. But anyway, I just wanted to, it made me think about that.
I also wanted to piggyback on that and address what Virla mentioned in this divide between contemporary art and more traditional art languages. And I think, like Marsha said, contemporary art can also work along white supremacy and, you know, perpetuate languages and ideas that are elitist or exclusive to the people that have spent many years training in these languages and you know, both, you know, text language, but also visual language, to put value on them. And at the same time, I also want to advocate for the idea that that type of education is also shared with a broader audience, because at the end of the day, the reasons why people put more value in, say, representational sculpture as a language that they can understand has to do with them being able to recognize, oh, this took a lot of time. Oh, this took so much effort. Oh, this is a face that I can see and understand, and it might look like me, or most of the time it doesn't look like me, but it's a face that I can see and understand, and it's dressed in this, you know, royal whatever. So there's like all of this recognizable things that part of the discussion of making more different types of language accessible to more people has to do with education and inclusion, and what are, you know, museums, institutions, and just regular artists doing in the street to broaden and diversify the audiences that have access to these different languages.
So we have some other comments. The Dean Ireland again. Art in Trinidad and Tobago is plagued by access, or I suppose you mean lack of access, and mainly due to poor representation. The artist registry has not been properly used, and there are projects, as I guess he knows of, that have suffered due to poor choices and decisions by project managers. From Yorle Alejandra Mendez, in Trinidad, we have the Lipanot estate, where African people who were trafficked and worked until death under conditions of chattel slavery are described as loyal slaves for the edification of tourists and school children. We have Annelie Davis, who's speaking about the removal of the Lord Nelson statue in Bridgetown, and hopefully to situate it in the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, as well as the new gallery space that has been established, with proper labeling. And to see its installation, there's an opportunity to tell a longer or larger story, its commissioning and subsequent decommissioning, and the current discussions to include the idea of contemporary artists responding to the site and the plinth. Holly would like to ask Camille, do we want to replicate the same procedure of monumentalism in this era of dismantling? And can we think about other means and strategies for public engagement with creatives in the Caribbean? And then the one last question from Holly: what is decolonial about the replication of a model if the function hasn't been contested? So I think Camille can respond, and then if the rest of you would like to jump in to think about answering these, you know, the comments as well as the questions that come after. Camille.
So I think, Holly might be talking about me mentioning that I want to see monuments of Black heroes, essentially, and you're saying that because this is currently failing, I think the reason it might be failing is because we've realized that these people represent or haven't fully been represented for their complete stories or their complete racist past, for the deeds that they have done. So I think it is a decolonization to also recognize other people, other groups that have been ignored in a similar modality, to erect faces that we can appreciate and that we know represent us. I think it's important to see ourselves in that kind of way and not just always, while I do like like these temporary interventions and plays with those monuments, I am the ones that are being taken down or that we want to be removed. While that happens, I still think it's really important for us to see ourselves and to have something that is, I wouldn't say permanent, because I don't know if going forward anything will be necessarily a permanent monument, but we might still have long-standing monuments towards situations that we recognize from our side of the story. Because if we're just going to have these temporary interventions, then it's just we're just going to have temporarily telling our story. So we need a long-standing thing as well, if that's what you meant by the question.
I don't know if it has to be like an either or situation. I think you can have both monuments that celebrate the people and the events that have been omitted from the main history so far, while also thinking further about these languages and these ideas of permanence and all of that. And I wanted to mention briefly something that I mentioned to Marsha when she interviewed me for her series, for her blog recently. That was also about languages and representation. So I'm not a Native American, but I'm not a Native American, but I wanted to mention this example of, I was researching Mount Rushmore recently and the history behind how that was built and why it was chosen to be represented in that way. And through that research, I learned about the controversies with the Dakota people there, and how there's like this parallel monument that has been in the process of being built in the last 70 years and hasn't been completed, dedicated to Crazy Horse, an Oglala Dakota leader, and how part of the controversy has to do with who is managing that construction and who has benefited from the touristic site that has been built on this partial monument that hasn't been completed. But another part also has to do with language and the decision to have this huge carving of a face that is going to be a huge body on a horse that desecrates this huge mountain, which, you know, it's an interesting choice, given that it's a mountain that it's sacred for these people, and then turning it into this like huge, I don't know, competition with this other Western white supremacist symbol. It's something that they question, and the choice of making that monument did have to do with like one indigenous leader that asked for that, but it wasn't. It didn't involve the community broadly, which is, I think, the root of all of these issues. So, yeah, just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, so all right. So there is we have 15 minutes left, and really we're going to take like the last 10 minutes because I don't want people, I know people are losing steam. But so we have two more. Shabaka Kaban, who says, thank you, Camille. This era is not for not just about dismantling for dismantling's sake. It's because what is celebrated or glorified is colonial violence. And then we have a very important question from Michael Lee Poi, which I think all of us who are, for myself and my other colleagues who are in museums and galleries, and as well as you guys of artists, this is an important question. How can you involve architects into this conversation, because they/we are the scientists of the built environment with appropriate tools which many artists and curators do not possess. The discussion is great, thank you. I think this is a very important question, right? Because architectural history, for example, is really about monument and space and the environment, and we have to also think about current scholarship around ecological activism and the intersection of artist interpretation around providing an additional voice for those who are environmentalists and ecologists. And the fact that, and Michael, I'm jumping in on your question just to interject one thing here. I visited the Apartheid Museum last year, and oh my God, I felt like, and the Hector Peterson Museum in Soweto. And one of the things that struck me, about the intervention in South Africa is that the museum space was deeply intertwined with landscaping, and the fact that your experience is not just about the historical content within the museum, but also the ambience and the feeling. And I feel like for us in the Caribbean, and I'm going to speak more specifically for the English speaking Caribbean, that what is lacking, I think, for a lot of our museum slash practice slash architecture practice is this lack of communication. I almost feel like we don't do a good job around the interdisciplinary, right? And that we get locked into silos, and then these silos don't include people who can bring these alternate tools to the task. And I actually think it's a legacy of colonialism, right? That you can only pursue particular professions in a particular way without them having conversation. What are your thoughts?
I want to say something really brief. I think public space, being public and being prone to these public conversations, is going to require from an artist to not have the same mentality that we have in our studios, where you get to make art for yourself and then you share it with an audience in these other private spaces. And it's more about your personal reflection. I think ideally moving forward, what we should have is this type of public discussions before putting stuff out there, and this type of, as you say, interdisciplinary collaborations with other professionals that can, I mean, that happens regardless. You're not gonna put like a huge bronze statue by yourself out there in a park, but I think there needs to be this collaboration from the beginning and from like moment zero, as opposed to after the fact. I think a lot of the issues that are being raised right now might be less prominent if that was the process when we were, having this these proposals for public space.
Okay, so let's take two more. Well, I'm going to say three. I just realized throughout our entire discussion, we did not define what is monumentalism, right? From the artist practice. And I know we have people who are listening and who are going to listen once this goes up on YouTube, that we haven't actually defined that for them. So we've been almost, I feel, dangerously talking to ourselves and allowing people to infer definitions. The comment by Simon Tatum Egotism and location can become such big dividers for contemporary art. How can we continue to get communities, public groups in the Caribbean involved in genuine conversation with creatives? How can communities continue to evolve with art education and help support creatives so they don't have to rely on exclusive art sectors and art groups? And he thinks, these town halls and interactions with residency projects have helped. Traveling exhibition, online information passed through hyperlink websites and social media have also helped. And then lastly, we have from Verley, when we look at contemporary statue controversies in Jamaica, Bob Marley, etc., one major factor is prevailing notions about what constitutes a proper statue. Bronze on pedal is a particular type of posing, with a particular type of posing, notions about respectability. These notions are undeniably colonial in origin and appear to be deeply internalized by general audiences. What can be done to dismantle these notions and to make way for more relevant, innovating, and engaging public art? So bearing these things in mind, I'm going to ask each of you for two minutes just to put in your last statements very clearly. 2 hours is not enough time for us to have these conversations, but more importantly, we are really just trying to create this space so that people can begin to think about these things and have discussions afterwards. Well, so each of you, please, your last statements.
Okay, so for me, monument is something that commemorates a moment or a person, and the contention comes from who we choose to do those and what situations we choose to highlight into monument form. I think Verley said that these things are colonial, and yeah, they are. So when I'm talking about, this kind of representation, I'm also looking at Olmec heads. I'm looking at pre-Columbian things or statues, or you look at Egyptian art as well. Outside of the traditional Western model, you have so many examples of commemoration that we can use, and that we can also try to develop our own unique language, referencing our ancestry, so Africa, the East, and so on. So there are models for how we move forward. A lot of that has been discussed, and there's somebody that was talking about education. Yeah, I think spaces like the museum format that we're having this conversation through, or the National Gallery or the institutes, they have a huge role to play in having these kinds of conversations and running programming around, do people have residencies where they explore monuments, interactions, interventions, and so on. There are a lot of ways that we can deal with the current situation, and I'm looking forward to being a part of more ongoing discussions about this.
For me, I see monuments as memories of a society. I think about history, and I think of in a broad way. For me, a monument could be a place, it could be a building, it could be an action, it could be a performance. I think that it's important that the artist does not work alone, that there needs to be collaboration with architects, urban designers. There needs to be a conversation that's rooted in the communities and in the histories that you want to commemorate. And I think it's a process, and it's a difficult conversation because we have to unlearn a lot of things, all of us, in different places. So, but I think it's an exciting time to to revisit and relearn and the truths about the places where we live and work, and to share with others.
I also think monuments are about memory. They're about remembering who we are, but not our neat and tidy, sanitized, neatly packaged selves, but ourselves in all of its complexities, all of its nuances. And that's why for me it was very important that I use Rex Nettleford's term, this idea of being textured. And for me, I think the monuments are an opportunity to celebrate that, to celebrate all of those dimensions of who we are. To return to Michael Lepoy's question, I think the architect adds another texture to this conversation. Knowledge is textured. We spoke about interdisciplinarity. Knowledge doesn't exist in silos, and so the architect has a role to play in there. To Verily's question, I think part of pushing back or dismantling notions are for us to look at the notions that we have been grappling with within our own space. So again, with Rex Nettleford proposing this idea of being textured, that counters an idea of the polished, and the proper and the respectable. And so for me, that is what monumentality is all about, looking at our breadth and our depth, engaging our scale with all of those nuances.
Yeah, for me, monuments also have to do with memorialization and artifacts that are there honoring and remembering the narratives that we want to, narratives and people that we want to remember. But they have also been a means to projecting and defining identity as a community. And they can also be a space for offering. I just wanted to highlight the role of education and dialogue and critical thinking in moving forward and making these and proposing these monuments and maybe challenge the idea of who has access to a monument and how is it that this is something thought as public always, right? Because for example, I've never been to Mount Rushmore. I don't know if I'll ever be there, if I'll ever visit that site. And something that I mentioned in another discussion that I was having about monuments recently was the monumentality of other things that have to do with the technology that we have now. So if a statue in a park that was built to live 200 or 500 years was a technology that they had 300 or 200 years ago. Now that we have photography and the screens and all of these other things, then what are ways that we can think about monumentality in a different way? And I was talking about photographs that have been monumental historically and continue to have a monumental impact, for example, as a way to think about this other modes of thinking about monuments. Yeah, and just thinking of different modes of approaching this conversation, diversifying who has access to proposing these conversations, and thinking about civil discussions and manifestations and just getting broader audiences engaged in this dialogue, because part of the reason why monuments have been so monolithical in the past is because there's a small number of people who make those choices. Yeah.
So, this was just such a great conversation. I just want to thank my great panelists who took time out to share in this conversation. This is a very important time in our fields, both in monuments, both in museums, galleries, and visual art work and culture. And I think we constantly have to definitely be rethinking how we engage our populace, our stakeholders. I want to thank the UWI Museum team. This would not be possible without my support in the background, who is moving the chats, the questions and statements from Facebook to Zoom to facilitate this. I also want to send a special shout out to Rosie, who is in charge of the Diasporic Vibe Curatorial Incubator initiative, and I think I'm messing up the name, but we met through another regional group called Tilton Access. And, you know, for a lot of people who are not practitioners, they don't know that we are actually speaking to each other in the Caribbean, and that we're also speaking to members in the diaspora, because in a way we need to be speaking to each other to broaden what we are offering our stakeholders. And we have to really think critically about the limitations of the structures and just the structures in which we operate and function, and the fact that for many of us in the Caribbean, we are state-run, funded institutions because finances are important, and many times the structures in which we operate limit how we can make great interventions in the future. I want to say thank you to our audience joining us on Facebook Live. As a reminder, we will be posting this on YouTube, and the UE Museum, yes, Diaspora Vibe Cultural Arts Incubator. Thank you. Right. We'll be posting this on YouTube, and it will be accessible. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at ue.museum@uemona.edu.jm, or just send us a message on our Facebook or via YouTube. And, you know, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to more conversation.